Billions are required to permanently resolve South Africa's energy crisis amidst the objective realities of an ailing economy and the politics around the need to embrace renewable energy. Does the country have what it takes to get the appropriate solutions for the much-needed energy security which we crave? Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mbofu-Walsh. When will load shedding end? Will South Africa ever resolve this problem? Joining me for this discussion is none other than Electricity Minister, Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa. Before we embark on our conversation, let's watch this insert produced by Skhangiwe Mtiane.
A number of countries in Europe are beginning to drift back to fossil fuel and coal. And it will happen with us as well. We're still excited now. We want to switch off coal now and think that everything will go well. I think part of the load shedding that we're experiencing was an effort to move out of coal quicker than we could. And as a result of that, we allowed many of the Eskom coal generating power stations to collapse under our nose because we thought that they're a dirty product and the result was darkness.
As various countries battle to find lasting solutions to their energy security, South Africa is waking up to the reality that its hurried commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 through the Just Energy Transition, or JET, without taking into consideration its negative impact on its already ailing economy, was an ill-considered decision. The JET partnership was established at the COP26 Climate Summit with contributions from France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union, which mobilized $8.5 billion over the next 3 to 5 years to support South Africa's energy transition plans.
A plan like this on the country's challenges and experiences. It should never be imposed on any country. In our case, we've had to take into account our own experience as a nation and as a country, where we are dealing with challenges such as unemployment and poverty, and also dealing with a history of division in our own country, of racial division and all that.
Despite the imposition on South Africa to close coal power stations in favor of renewable energy, global superpowers such as the United States of America and Britain were accused of double standards as they continue to not only use but are also building new coal power plants. In 2022, Europe imported 14.3 million tons of coal, an increase of more than 520% from the previous year.
We
haven't had electricity for the past 6 days. There's people here with babies. There's people that's on respirations. They have no power.
According to the South African Research Chair's initiative, load shedding disproportionately affects the urban poor in South Africa as they are the most vulnerable to the impact of power cuts. This is because low-income households and communities often lack the financial means to afford alternative energy sources or the additional energy costs during load shedding. Since 2007, the country has been experiencing load shedding at various intensities, reaching unprecedented levels in recent years. This after many years of the state's failure to restore aging coal plants, poor management and corruption. As South Africa continues to implement its energy action plan, the country saw some reprieve last month where load shedding was minimized as part of the 6-month winter plan. But the plan has also seen reversals due to various unit failures and outage slippages. Part of the bigger plan includes the restructuring of Eskom to separate its generation, transmission and distribution operations, a move that will require massive financial investments.
we are behind where we want to be from a planning point of view as a result of the limited financing. And you see that going into the future for the financial year 2025, they'll need about close to about 100 billion rands, and then gets to be ramped up by 2029, we'll need close to about 170 billion rand.
As households continue to experience darkness, businesses being disrupted, and the general economy suffering, contributing to high unemployment and poverty, South Africans cannot wait to see the end of the load-shedding nightmare. Is the state doing enough to restore public confidence in its energy security plan? For Unfiltered, I'm Skangiri Mtiani.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. Dr. Ramokgopa, Minister, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Caesar, for the invitation, and good evening to the viewers back at home.
Good evening. It's hard to think of a South African minister who's come in under so much pressure, and we appreciate your arrival. But South Africans, I don't think with any other interview I've done, have asked me to ask so many questions to a guest. So I'm sure you feel that pressure. But could I ask you first, when will load shedding end?
Well, how I answer that question is to say that we need about 6,000 megawatts, additional megawatts into the grid. So when the President unveiled the Energy Action Plan, our computation was that we were short of 6,000 megawatts. So my efforts is to make sure that I add those additional megawatts onto the grid. And when we announced the winter outlook, essentially our projection on what will be the aggregate demand and the performance on the generation side, we could tell that because we're going into winter, the worst case scenario, and that worst case scenario was modeled on the following. First was that it projected that the demand will peak at about 34,000 megawatts, and that the rate at which the units are fading, what we call the unplanned capacity loss factor, will take out about 18,000 megawatts. And then if we continued on the trajectory of the performance, when we entered the winter period, about 48-50% energy availability factor, that talks to the efficiency and the performance of the plants. Then if those three are present...
Forgive me, Minister,
yes.
But I do appreciate the numbers and the number of megawatts that we do need to bring on. But I think the question for me is one of timing, i.e., when do you think we will have the sufficient megawatts to end load shedding? So
I think it was important to make that projection. So let me illustrate to you. So when we started early in April, we're sitting at 48% energy availability factor. And now as I talk to you, are averaging about 60%. And just to bring it into numbers, 1 percentage point amounts to about 477 megawatts. So we have added, if you like, 12 percentage points to that. So you are talking something in the order of magnitude of about, let's say, 6,000 megawatts that has been added into the grid. And then going into the immediate future, we are anticipating that they will continue to see improvements on the energy availability factor, and we are anticipating to bring on stream about 3 units at Tutuka. Tutuka is one of our worst performing power stations, but what the head of generation has done at Eskom, Mr. Bheki Nxumalo, was to place one of the most seasoned and experienced general managers. Bruce is being placed at Tutuka, and the projection is that we are likely going to get another 3 units at Tutuka. Each unit packs about 560 megawatts. So you're talking something in the order of magnitude of 1,680 megawatts that should come on stream by the end of August. And then we're going into the Kusile. You know that there's 3 units that had failed there as a result of the compromise structural integrity of the chimney there as a result of the failure of the flue gas desulfurization unit, which is meant to remove the amount of sulfur content that we are emitting. So we had to remove those 3 units, and then we applied for a special dispensation to have alternative stacks so that we bypass that unit that has failed. So our projection is that we'll get another 2,400 megawatts.
Absolutely.
So when you put that together, you can see that we are getting back our megawatts.
No doubt. And I think South Africans can see a certain amount of progress. You certainly appear to be a very hardworking minister. But my question was, when? Do we have a date clear in our minds as to when load shedding will end? I'll tell you why I ask that, because many people connected to our energy policy, from Eskom to ministries, have been asked this question: when will load shedding end? And there seems to be a concerted attempt to keep that vague, keep that ambiguous. So, for example, the chairperson of Eskom couldn't give us a date. Is there a deliberate attempt not to set a date and keep South Africans guessing so that you then won't be held accountable for that date?
No, there's no deliberate attempt. So what I'm trying to illustrate is these megawatts that are coming on stream. And remember that it's also a function of demand. And one of the things that I can't guarantee now as I speak to you is the rate of failure of these units. And that's why you have a situation where you are able to move in a space of about 6 hours. Eskom announces that we are stage 2, and then suddenly we are stage 3, we end up at stage 5. So one of the things that we are building into the performance of the grid is their reliability. And the best way of doing that is that once we create this buffer that I've referred to, because we do expect as we come out of winter that demand is going to taper down. And I've shared with you the additional megawatts that we are bringing on stream. So what we are going to do in that period, we are going to do what we call opportunity maintenance. So we know that there are units that are notorious for failure without announcing. We take those out because we have planned to fix them, and then we return them into the grid. So if you were to ask me, at the rate at which we anticipate the consumption when we go into summer, I think it peaks at about 28,000 megawatts. You will have sufficient amount of megawatts into the grid to meet that demand. And then you are likely going to have, most likely, going to have instances where we go day after day without any load shedding. But we have not resolved load shedding. That's the point I'm making. The best measure of our degree to end load shedding is when I have sufficient amount of megawatts that are reliable in the grid to meet our computation of what is peak demand. Winter, we are getting out of winter, but there's still a winter season that's coming. So if I have sufficient amount of megawatts to meet what we call peak demand, and our projection, the historic peak, is about 34,000 megawatts. And on that 34,000 megawatts, you make provision for the reserve margin. That's about 2,200 megawatts that is required at all times to be able to protect the grid. And then you must factor into that additional megawatts that will accommodate any failure that might arise. And that's why I'm not in a position to say by this date, but I'm able to say to you, by this date, you are going to get an additional about 5,800 megawatts.
And which date is that?
And that's the date. And that's the date, the 24th of December. And I can illustrate that to you. I did say that we are expecting these units, 3 units from Tutuka. They pack each 560 megawatts, so you get about 1,680.
And are you
megawatts.
confident that we're on the road to that 5,800 megawatts by the 24th of December?
I'm more than confident. And remember, also in that projection, I've not computed the expected improvement in the energy availability factor. And that confidence is drawn from the fact that we are collaborating with private sector. We have been able to reorganize, if you like, some of the most seasoned general managers. We have taken them to the stations that are notorious. We have been able to isolate those units that are problematic. We know the kind of the failure rate and the sources of failure, and galvanize private sector expertise to help us to improve that. So in that computation, I've not included the projected improvement in the energy availability factor. I'm simply making an assumption that at the worst case scenario, we remain at 60% energy availability factor. And as we add those megawatts, it improves the energy availability factor.
The reason I asked this question, Minister, is I think it's one thing to say we can expect load shedding to subside.
Yes.
But the real question on South Africans' minds is when will we be out of the woods?
Yes.
And don't you think it's a mistake to keep South Africans guessing about that? Because what it comes across as is that actually no one knows. No one actually knows when load shedding is going to end. And that creates a sense of perennial uncertainty. Whereas if we were able to say, even if it was far in the distance, look, it's going to be 2025, at least we would be able to then, as a country, have the certainty that someone out there has at least had the confidence to say this is going to end and it's not going to carry on forever?
It's an important question, and a question rather. And remember that there are multiple variables that are at play. So I try to illustrate on the demand side. So I'm saying to you, and I'm saying to the South African public, that when we enter that December period, we'll have sufficient megawatts to meet the summer conditions. And then once we meet those summer conditions, it means that people are going to experience days after days without any load shedding, breathing room.
Then we wait for the winter.
And then the winter is coming. But also remember that the investor community is also looking at opportunities to invest in the South African economy. And once there's that confidence that the South African economy government has resolved the load shedding because we are not experiencing days of unmet demand, then there's additional investment that is placed. And that investment then places additional requirements on the grid. And that's why it's important that as we resolve the immediate solution, making sure that the lights are on 24 hours of the day, we need to urgently ensure that we roll out other new generation sources to ensure that we are able to meet the anticipated demand. And that's why the emergency procurement program is important and focusing on base loads. I think there's a very little attention that has been given to gas, and it's going to receive an elevated attention. When you go to the next round of the ministerial determination, essentially me as the minister saying we are going to procure X number of megawatts from this technology, you will see that gas is going to be a major part of that. So we need to build that resilience. Yes, I mean, we are on course to do that. But that we have resolved load shedding, no. You resolve load shedding when there's sufficient capacity in the grid to allow for the growth that is required. Otherwise, growth will be stunted. And that's the point that I'm making, Caesar.
Let's go to a break, Minister. We'll be back after the break. Continue to engage with us on social media. And after the break, we'll come back to discuss matters of the energy availability factor and, in fact, the just energy transition. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. I'm in conversation with Electricity Minister Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa. Minister, just before we went to the break, we were discussing the date of the end of load shedding. One thing that comes to my mind, South Africans were bracing for a very difficult winter. You were predicting, Eskom board chair was predicting a very hard winter, and then suddenly things changed. Why do you think those predictions went wrong?
Well, what we did, we generated scenarios, if you like. So we had the optimistic scenario. And that optimistic scenario had the following, or in fact, all three scenarios. So the first one was an assumption on demand. That demand is going to surge, it's going to be at 34,000 megawatts. That's a historic peak during winter. And then the second one was that the rate of failure of these units, what we call the unplanned capacity loss factor, will reach about 18,000 megawatts. So there's 18,000 megawatts that is taken out of the grid. And then the third one was that you are not going to see the kind of improvement in the energy availability factor at the rate at which we had registered that. And essentially the EAF really is about the performance and the efficiency of these units will be at about 53%. So if those three were present, then you're going to have elevated levels of load shedding, stage 8+. So that's what. And then there was a middle case scenario, and then the optimistic scenario was saying that the surge in demand will not be at 34,000 megawatts. You'll be at about 32,000 megawatts. So 2,000 megawatts less than the extreme, the worst case scenario on the demand side. And the second one was that we're optimistic that we can improve the energy availability factor, and then by definition, we bring down the unplanned capacity loss factor to be at 15,000 megawatts. So the difference is that the performance in the units will give you an additional 3,000 megawatts. And then on that scenario, the optimistic case, we're going to have about stage 5, stage 6. Guess what? So the actions that have been taken by the board of Eskom should not be understated, led by Mr. Makwana. And I must say that there is a team of competent men and women who really put their credibility at risk because of Eskom is a poison chalice. And all that they wanted to do was to make a contribution to this country. And they make one of the most decisive appointment, that of the head of generation, Mr. Beking Numalo. So when he came in, they reorganized the team, took those team members with the best experience, tried and tested, to the stations that are notorious for giving us a very low energy availability factor. And then isolated the units that are problematic. And for each and every unit, then they had a set of action on what needed to be done. And that's why then, how we upset that scenario is that the improvement in the energy availability factor now was exponential. So we moved from 48%, we added 12 percentage points, we're at 60% EAF. And then by definition, it means that the rate of failure of the units came down at about 15,000 megawatts. And in some instances, we even went up to about 13,500 megawatts.
Can I ask on that?
So all of that then undermined those scenarios, and that's why we had a relatively bearable winter. I must say that by any measure, load shedding is unacceptable. But essentially, they were able to take us out of winter with the least amount of harm. Of course, we've suffered injuries, the people and the economy.
Can I ask on that? Because one way of looking at that is yes, unplanned outages went better than expected. The EAF went up, energy availability factor, I think we're at around 60 now, if I'm not mistaken, give or take a few.
That's right.
Yeah. But did South Africans actually bail you out to some extent in that demand has been lower because so many households and so many businesses have been finding their own solutions? That in actual fact, what happened is we reached a tipping point where demand luckily didn't go as high as it would because South Africans have solved the problem for themselves. And in actual fact, the work that's being done to improve the energy availability factor doesn't contribute as much as the demand reduction of South Africans themselves.
Your point is correct, and I was going to make it later. So first, let's not understate the improvement in the energy availability factor. It's really the resilience and the performance, the reliability of these units. These are the things that will take us out. Yeah. But remember, part of the decarbonization agenda, it's about distributed generation. So by distributed generation, we simply mean that we have households that generate for themselves, they meet their own needs, of course, over time. Once we introduce a framework on feed-in tariff, that excess generation capacity, that of course, that which you are not using, you are able to feed it back into the grid, and the grid benefits from that. So this has always been part of the plan, to say to industry that you can introduce measures that you generate your own electricity. I mean, part of the energy action plan that the president unveiled does anticipate that, because part of the reforms that we have introduced was to remove the cap on embedded generation, essentially creating a dispensation, a policy framework that enable big industries to make interventions behind the meter. So it's an aggregation of this effort. So it mustn't be seen in isolation. It must be seen as part of the totality of these efforts. Okay. And of course, by definition, then you are bringing down, if you like, demand. And as generation improves, then the delta, the difference between demand and generation gets to be closed, and therefore you have not so much intensified levels of load shedding. But the point I'm registering is that the issues around the rooftop solar solution by industry and households, the issues around embedded generation are part of this reform agenda to make it possible for us to have a distributed grid, so that we are able to harness our own renewable sources like the sun to be able to generate. So it's part of that broader agenda. Let's
talk about that, and let's turn our attention to this debate that has been raging in our country for a long time. I want to put some statements of the former GCEO of Eskom to you, who says, "I can see no other opportunity to drive economic growth, to solve for energy security, to solve for our environmental problems, to create employment, than by embarking on this just energy transition." Do you go along with the just energy transition in its totality, or do you think it's actually misguided?
Well, I think that it must be nuanced. So it must be given what I call South African characteristics. And I think that there are elements that are necessary in that conversation, given our... Do you think we went
too far before you arrived?
Yes, and I want to explain that. So the first element is about the democratization of the conversation. So an upstream democratization of the conversation, because now it's a conversation by the enlightened, those who are educated. It's a boardroom discussion. So we are undermining and diluting the agency of communities to articulate their position on how they see this just energy transition. And I do accept that it's a complex conversation underpinned by science, but it's important that the communities are not just spectators or recipients of what the solutions are, but they must be actively involved. That's the first part. The second part is around the fact that you still have energy famine. You still have 7% of the households are not connected to the grid. So that conversation must take that into account. And I do accept that you can leapfrog in terms of technology. You don't necessarily have required to be connected to the grid to have access to energy. I did say the renewable energy solution, they give you an additional and alternative platform to connect the rural communities. The third one is that the conversation should not be about it's environmental and ecological centric. So the conversation is about the environment. It's a very necessary conversation. It talks about posterity. Science has proven the emissions alter, if you like, the equilibrium, and therefore you have climate change, and it's devastating the poorest of communities. We have seen the floods, the issues of drought. But in that calculus, we need to factor in what I call the socio-economic consideration. I mean, just today I was meeting some of the mayors in Mpumalanga, and they were making the point that the primary engines of the economies is this the mines that are feeding into the coal-fired power station. And when you close this coal-fired power station, you are essentially decimating, if you like, the economic profile of those areas. So if you are to close them at the rate at which we're advocating for, you will not have a province called Mpumalanga in economic terms. So the point I'm raising is about the cadence of that transition, because we are sitting with an energy crisis. I think that it doesn't augur well when you accelerate the decommissioning of these megawatts when in fact you are sitting with an energy deficit. And the fourth and last consideration with regards to that just energy transition is your ability to industrialize on the back of this crisis, to ensure that because they see through of demand with regards to renewable solar PV, battery and inverters, that you are able to create an industry and economy, and you allow your development finance institution to aggressively invest in local production, manufacturing, so that as you transition, you create new skills because you are creating a demand. And in that way, I think you are able to articulate the just, giving it South African characteristics, and without deviating from the need and the necessity for us to decarbonize. Science has proven that, so that is beyond any question.
Let's go to a break, Minister. I'm going to take you up on one of the specific things you've said about that after the break, but we're in conversation with Energy Electricity Minister Kgosientsho Ramokgopa. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to ask him about the Komati power station, tensions between different ministries, and where we go from here. Don't go anywhere. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're in an exclusive conversation with Electricity Minister Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa. Minister, you made some headlines recently by saying, and I quote, "If I had my way, we would go and restart Komati, a power station that was decommissioned in December 2022 or October, towards the end of last year." Do you stand by those statements?
Yes, of course, there was a context to that conversation, but I think the point I'm making is not different from the points I made earlier on. I'm saying that you are sitting in the midst of an energy deficit. I don't think that it makes any rational sense for you to continue to decommission at the rate and pace at which we had been advocating for. And I think what is important is for us to first maintain the number of megawatts that are there on the grid and ensure that to the extent that is possible, we are able to add additional megawatts. And the quickest way of doing it is improving the performance of the existing and installed units. Of course, Komati, I mean, I can't cry over spilled milk. milk. I mean, it's closed. I don't think we'll go back to that. So what is important is that of the units that were on stream to be decommissioned, we made an argument to say that, look, we're looking for additional megawatts. In our considered opinion, we must delay the decommissioning of...
So you're not advocating for the reopening of Komati?
Oh, no. It's so that's done and dusted. So so I was making in the context of the conversation. I mean, if you had entered into that conversation and it was still generating, we're going to still make the same argument. I mean, for an example, when I entered into this space, when I went to a power station called Camden, one unit at Camden was meant to be discontinued the following day. And of course, in the context of this crisis, we're able to make a case, the cabinet, and we're able to prevail to say that this is not a deviation on the decarbonization agenda. I think the point I'm simply making is that there are sovereign interests, and everything must subordinate to the sovereign interest. Sovereign interest must trump any other interest. And having said all of that, it doesn't remove our obligations to international protocols, but is the rate, the cadence, the velocity at which we are doing that. First is to protect the South African economy. There are many viewers can't watch us because they are load shed. There are people who are out of jobs because of load shedding. Farmers are finding it very difficult to compete, and they have to pass on that cost to the end consumer. I was reading the results of one of the big major retailers in the country making the point that they had to spend up to 1.3 billion rands in relation to diesel to maintain and sustain their operation. They are going to pass on that cost to the end consumer. And if you look at the percentage that the poor spends on a basket of food, I mean, it's disproportionate. So what that means is that the poor are disproportionately impacted by load shedding. The South African Reserve Bank has done some robust modeling. One stage of unmet demand, 1,000 of unmet demand, translate into a contraction in the South African economy of about 5%. So those are the things that are facing us. So it's important that we're able to go out of this period with this installed capacity as we accelerate the rate at which we connect the renewables. And of course, transmission infrastructure is going to be key, an enabler to ensure that we're able to connect them to the grid. But where I am, the mandate is to keep the lights on. There are assets that are there. They are old, they are aging. We are not able to sweat them at the rate at which we desire. They are not producing at the desired, at the design life, but they are producing something. So we're maintaining them, and the aspects that they are extracting a lot out of it. But it's important that we are able to build new generation capacity going into the future.
I mean, part of the ability for our country to do that is to make sure that there are people who are appointed to all the right positions to do that. Eskom's group CEO, we still don't have an appointment there. And I was looking at some of the statements from Mr. Makwana, who 4 months ago said the appointment would be made in a matter of months. Minister Gordhan, tabling the public enterprises budget this year, said the board is on course to identifying a group CEO, and within the next month, I think this was 3 months ago, there should be some announcements. Are you concerned? You don't appoint the CEO, but the CEO being there is key to your role. Are you concerned that it's taking longer than many people have promised us to make this crucial appointment?
You're making an exceptionally valid point. I think you need a leader, someone to galvanize, if you like, the troops, to rally them behind this agenda. And I think that an executive who's a CEO is appropriately placed to lead that agenda inside Eskom. There's so much that we can do as an executive authority. There are boundaries. And so you're absolutely right to say that we need to accelerate, if you like, that appointment. The one thing that I will not do is to venture into areas of corporate governance. So the person who runs the ship in relation to that appointment is the board of Eskom, and I'm going to respect the articulation and public pronouncements of Mr. Makwana. We really have an exceptionally good working relationship. And of course, it will be passed on to government, to Minister Gordhan as a shareholder representative, and at the right time, Minister Gordhan bring it to cabinet for concurrence. So I'm going to leave that into that domain. But the point that I agree with you on, and I think it's something that is shared, I know with confidence, Mr. Makwana, the chair of the board, and the board by extension, and Mr. Gordhan, is that we need to bring certainty, and we'll wait for them to make that determination. But in the meantime, we continue to ensure that we address this situation, working with the acting CEO, Kalip, and the collective of the management team, of course, and the board to resolve this problem. And at the right time, that determination will be made.
Can I ask you about your relationship with Minister Gordhan? He's one of the other ministers. Do you feel that that relationship is working appropriately? Do you feel that there's mutual support between your ministry and that ministry that will ensure that the cooperation and the coordination necessary is actually happening?
Well, part of the reason why we're able to be where we are and we're able to register relatively good progress is primarily as a result of that healthy relationship. And that's why on the issue of the CEO, I do make the point, is his domain, so I will not encroach into that. And then he allows me the opportunity to engage with the staff at Eskom, the managers at the station level. I don't have to go and seek permission from him, but we are coordinating those efforts. So he protects the interest of the shareholder from a corporate governance point of view. He drives the agenda on the establishment of the transmission company. So he's doing that, and he has been on public platform to say that we are at a stage where we will be announcing the board of that entity on transmission. So he's doing that work, but my responsibility is to make sure that we have the lights on, and that's how we've been able to coordinate our work. And I must say that it has been mutually reinforcing, and the health and the temperature of that gets to be reflected in the work that we are doing. We are not at cross purposes. In instances where there might be a difference of opinion, we sit down, iron it out, but there hasn't been a situation where we are diametrically opposed in relation to.
Does the same go for Minister Mantashe? Of course, some of his powers were moved into your ministry. Has that caused any tension, and do you feel that you're getting the right cooperation from that ministry?
No, exceptional cooperation and support. I mean, provides a significant counsel. I mean, he's someone who has been in the domain for some time. So we do exchange these views. We do have conversation about his experiences in relation to what needs to be done. And I draw from that experience. I think what has been very empowering in this space is that the ministers that have been there before have graced and supported this new ministry and given me the latitude and the opportunity to be able to bring a renewed additional energy to the energy that they had. And that's why we are able to drive this. I must say that it's not a public relations statement. It's a genuine reflection on the nature of the relationship that I have with the two ministers, including Minister Godongwana. He's very important in the mix because he's the one who determined the conditions for the fiscal support. So to the extent that we think that there has to be a rethink on one area or the other, we have those engagement. And of course, we have an arm's length relationship with Minister Barbara Chris. It's an arm's length because he's a final arbiter with regards to the EIA. She can be actively involved, but just bringing her to speed. For an example, when we do the temporary stakes at Kusile, we have to share by law with her what are the additional mitigation measures that we are going to introduce. So you don't have a blank check to bypass the flue gas desulfurization unit and then expose people to danger as a result of increased levels of sulfur dioxide. We still have an obligation to prove to her that we are doing every measure, we're taking measures necessary to ensure that we are mitigating against the emissions of sulfur dioxide.
Let's take a break, Minister, and after the break, we'll come back. We'll take some of your comments on social media. I know many of you have been keen to ask the Minister some questions. We'll also inquire as to where to from here, what we can expect over the short to medium term, and exactly how the chronic crisis of load shedding can finally be ended. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. I'm in an exclusive conversation with Electricity Minister Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa. Before we continue, let's go to some of your social media comments and see what you've been saying. I know that many of you have been commenting on social media. Let me also encourage you to keep commenting on social media, and we'll go to some of those comments before the end of the show. But Minister, I guess the question is also where to from here? And where to in terms of allowing and unlocking the economy to actually grow as opposed to just maintain its stagnant 1%. Where to and how fast do you think we can get to not only resolving load shedding, but getting onto a growth trajectory which meets our national development plan goals for resolving unemployment, inequality, poverty, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's an opposite question. I did make the point earlier on to say that the resolution of load shedding is an immediate task, but it doesn't guarantee resilience and the kind of energy reliability that can anchor the growth of the South African economy. And that's why one of the issues that we're elevating in the conversation that must happen parallel to the resolution of load shedding is an investment in the transmission infrastructure. So if you look at the configuration of the transmission, for obvious historic reason, is that the density is concentrated in the northeast because power stations are constructed at the mouth of coal mines, and therefore they're going to have a significant amount of transmission, and of course industry will locate closer to where transmission is to minimize the losses, technical losses associated with moving electrons over a long distance. And that's why the northern part of our country consumes about 72% of the load. But if you were to look at the opportunities in relation to renewable energy sources, is that if you had to do an irradiation atlas, essentially trying to compute the best quality of irradiation levels so that we are able to optimize the renewable energy sources from the sun, is located in the Northern Cape. And a significant amount of real estate, the biggest landmass, least populated, and therefore there's areas where you can do solar PV farms. And if you had to do a wind atlas, essentially trying to compute where you're going to get the best wind speed, is on the coastal areas of the Western Cape and the Northern Cape. But what do we know about those three provinces is that there's absolutely no grid capacity. So that undermines our decarbonization agenda and bring on board new generation sources. And therefore it's important that we're able to expand these lines to accommodate these sources of new generation. If you look at Eskom, the past 10 years, they've been able to roll out about 4,000 kilometers of new lines. In terms of the rate at which we want to bring on board new renewables and ensure that the economy, the generation is resilient to support the kind of growth that we want, Eskom must build in the next 10 years 14,000 kilometers of new lines. We are growing that the experience by 3.5-fold. So we are going to need significant amount of investment. We know that the Eskom balance sheet can accommodate the kind of investment that is required. We've done a desktop study that suggests that we need anything upwards of 210 billion rands. And we know that the fiscal matrix is also deteriorated. So it's important that we are able to tap into private sector, the liquidity that sits in there. But as you do that, you don't relinquish ownership of the grid. The grid still remains the asset of the state. But we must design it in such a way that you are able to draw on that liquidity and also ensure that at the cost at which you are going to make those investments is not going to make energy unaffordable. I think it's important. So it is that mix, we are working on it, and that's what is going to define the future, because it's going to unlock, if you like, this huge investments from the private sector. As I speak to you, the energy intensive users, they say to us they've got 13 gigawatts of healthy projects that are ready to be invested. And Eskom and the players in the renewable energy space had done a study outside the intensive energy users, and they found that there's about 66 gigawatts of projects that are there, which gives us an opportunity to make significant investment in the renewable energy space, help us to decarbonize, create new platforms for skills and knowledge creation, broaden the industrial base, and then attract the investment going to the future. So for me, that's a picture, a more long-term horizon. But as we do that, the credibility of our ability to achieve that long-term horizon rests on our ability to resolve the now. Because I think what I'm saying is meaningless for as long as the lights are off. So it's important that the lights are on, and a parallel conversation is how we structure the transmission to allow private sector to come into that space without relinquishing ownership of the grid. The grid will at all times be owned by the state.
Absolutely. Let's go to those social media comments now and see what you've been saying and some questions you've been wanting to ask the minister. Olisi says, we have a double crisis in Pares, Free State. We are forever without electricity. The load shedding problems are compounded by unscrupulous municipal load rotations. Can the minister please intervene in this dire situation? Let's go to another tweet. Ota says, Eskom supplies load shedding plus low voltage, low power, and this affects businesses. For example, 50,000 Kolini broilers died, and people who rely on electronic machines for their health. Can the minister explain how long are they planning to continue with under voltage supply? Very cool dude, says Ramokgopa on Unfiltered. Don't forget to use the hashtag. Who was eating and who was letting them eat? And we have many comments today. Mwalimu says, he said in December, but I doubt. This is about whether we can resolve the electricity crisis. Karen says, when will the IRP be updated? And that's our final tweet. Minister, we're coming to the end of our conversation, so if you could just briefly and summarize your responses to the various social media interventions.
Yeah, I must say that one of the biggest problems that is confronting us is on the distribution side, which is really the domain of municipalities. You find that the assets that are there, the substations, are of poor quality. They are not designed to carry the kind of load that they are carrying now, and they explode, and then municipalities don't have enough funds to replace that. So one of the things we are working on with Minister Godongwa and, of course, with Eskom is to see to it on how best we introduce, if you like, any interventions on how we can be able to address the distribution side. If you look at the ecosystem of the energies, generation, transmission, so I've spoken about these two, the distribution side is an area that requires attention. I mean, also, when I was meeting with the mayors of the municipalities in the Khartsiba and the district municipality, they do make the point about the kind of challenges that are confronting them. So I really want to give comfort to the viewers there that is something that is receiving our attention. You have situations where there is no load shedding, but people still don't have electricity. And that has to do with the asset at the municipal level. There's been underinvestment of about 2.5 billion rand per annum. That is accumulated to about 30 billion rand. And hence we are sitting with this problem. On the IRP, the expectation is that we should have it released in the next 2 months. So the IRP, for the benefit of the viewers, it talks about the energy mix. What are these energy sources? What is the percentage share of each energy source, so that there's an appreciation of our ability to decarbonize and the sources that are going to anchor the South African generation.
And that'll be the first time you lead that process.
Yes. So that's what will be happening. So of course, I mean, I genuinely don't expect people to believe what I've shared with you, because our performance has been checked. So it's fine. I mean, one is that Mwalimu makes the point that, no, we just don't believe. And I said to the team that the best way of making sure that people believe is to deliver on that which we have promised. And in that way, we are able to build, if you like, confidence. And I want to say to the South African people that we have done everything possible. We have gone out of winter with little injury. I'm not saying without no injury, without no harm. So we're still subjected now to stage 4, but you'll see this will begin to taper down. These units will come on board. I'm more than confident, bullish about our ability to resolve load shedding, and I can show you where these megawatts are going to come from. So it's not a general statement, but it's to say that these megawatts will come from these areas. I do accept their levels of impatience and anger. People have lost jobs. Farmers are unable to produce. This has got inflationary pressures. The poor are disproportionately affected. Those who want to invest in the South African economy, they are beginning to rethink other jurisdictions where to place their money, and that's an opportunity cost to this country. The Reserve Bank has done that modeling. It does great injury to the South African economy, and that translates into poverty, into hunger. So we know what our people are confronted with, and we are doing everything possible to resolve this. You don't have to believe me, but you will see the lights will be on.
What's been the hardest part of your job over the last 4 months?
Well, just convincing my family that I'm up to the task. I mean, it takes a lot of strength. It's tough. It's exceptionally tough. So I don't have to sugarcoat it. It's exceptionally tough. You are in the microscope. You are a focal point. People don't have electricity. All they think is that useless minister. People are out of work. All they think is that useless minister. But I'm confident. When I accepted the responsibility, I know that I've got both the intellectual faculties, I've got the energy, I've got the know-how, but most importantly, a board that is exceptionally competent and committed to this, and a team of workers of Eskom, patriotic, professional, and are committed to the resolution of this problem. When you put all this together, and of course championed by President Ramaphosa, I'm confident we'll get out of this very, very difficult situation of existential proportions. We will resolve load shedding.
Minister, thank you so much for joining us on Unfiltered.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
And thank you for joining us this evening on Unfiltered. Minister Kgosietso Ramokgopa has been at the bull's eye of South Africa's energy crisis. Are we beginning to see the signs of a recovery, or will our hearts be broken as we plunge into darkness again? Let's continue this conversation on social media. When will load shedding end? It's the perennial question, and it's one we've tried to answer tonight. Look forward to continuing this conversation, and don't forget to join the next installment of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good evening.